Good afternoon, everyone. The time is now 12:01, so we would like to get started. My name is Leanne De Rouche. I'm the Executive Director of the Domestic Violence, Legal Empowerment, and Appeals Project, DV-LEAP for short, based in Washington, D.C. It's such a pleasure to have you all here today. We have people from across the country, and we're actually an international crowd with some folks here today joining us from Canada. So please excuse my clocks. It's now 12 noon, as you can tell. So again, welcome. This is the first of two events that we'll be hosting this month. We encourage you to use the chat today. You will notice that Flora Patel, who we want to thank for doing all of her magic behind this event today. Flora is staff at DV-LEAP, and she'll be dropping things into the chat as appropriate today. So for example, you'll be able to register for our event that we're having on March 24th with victims' rights lawyer, Carrie Goldberg. Some of you may be familiar with her book, Nobody's Victim. And we'll be hosting that on March the 24th. You'll find that link in the chat. That event is also free to you. Today's event, Survivors of Color, we are so pleased to be presenting this. This is the first time DV-LEAP has had a Women's History Month series of events. We're excited to bring this opportunity for you and for all of us to come together today and hear from both DV-LEAP and also from Safe Sisters Circle. This event was actually organized by DV-LEAP's Advocacy Council. If that's something that you might be interested in, they serve as ambassadors for the organization. Feel free to reach out to us. Also, if you are a lawyer, if you are interested in providing pro bono services, we welcome the opportunity to collaborate with you. Please let us know. If you are a legal service provider and you'd like to refer clients to us, we would be happy to do that. Let me just say quickly a little bit about DV-LEAP. We are a national organization. We provide pro bono legal appeals to domestic violence survivors across the country. So again, if you are joining us today as a legal service provider and you have clients perhaps that you would like to refer to us or would like to talk more about collaboration, we welcome that. Please do reach out to us. So again, if you want to learn more about the Advocacy Council, contact us. If you'd like to join us on one of our cases as pro bono counsel, please contact us as well. We'd love to hear from you, and we're always looking for new ways to collaborate. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce to you today the moderator for our panel, Katie Sochacki. So Katie is a member of our Advocacy Council and also an associate at the law firm Venable. And Katie is going to be introducing our panelists and then moderating it today. So Katie, thank you so much. I'll let you take it away. Good to see you. And thanks everybody for joining us today.
Thank you, Leanne, and thank you everyone for joining us. I will introduce our panelists in a moment, but I wanted to start with just an overview of what we will be discussing today. So the first we want to discuss the challenges faced by survivors when they are navigating or trying to seek protection or accountability in the legal system today. And when we do this, we're going to have a specific focus, as the name of the event suggests, on people of color, particularly Black and Brown survivors. And then we will talk about how these survivors face unique difficulties really throughout the whole process of their interactions in the legal system, from an initial call to law enforcement, throughout trial court proceedings, and to the appellate level. And then after discussing these challenges, we'll turn to discussing some potential solutions and the possibility of creating systems that better support survivors and provide protection. So now to introduce our panelists, we're so grateful to have Alana and Sasha here. Alana is the Executive Director of the Safe Sisters Circle here in DC, and Sasha Drobnick is the Legal Director of DV-LEAP. We asked them to join us today because they have unique experience representing survivors at all stages of the legal system, so we're really grateful for their expertise. And I will let Alana and Sasha tell you all a little bit more about themselves and their work, and maybe what drew them to working with survivors of domestic violence. Starting with Alana.
Hi, good afternoon. So I work with the organization, the Safe the Circle. I'm a public interest attorney there and executive director, and we provide legal services for Black women survivors of domestic violence and sexual violence, primarily living in Ward 7 and 8 of the District of Columbia area. And we provide representation in civil protection order hearings, family law cases such as custody and child support, and criminal court advocacy if the client wishes to go that route and do the criminal route, or if they wish not to do that route, we represent them also in those cases. What got me interested in domestic violence is that I always wanted to go to law school to help people. And growing up in DC area, I saw a lot of domestic violence in friends relationships and in relationships of friends' parents. And I knew that was something I wanted to address when I got older. And then out of law school, I worked at a job which let me do domestic violence and sexual abuse work. And so I knew I kind of wanted to continue that work as I grew up my career. So I just kind of followed that passion to my career that where I'm at right now.
Should I go ahead?
Yeah.
Thanks, Katie, and thanks, Alana, and thanks everyone for being here. It's great to be able to share the hour with you. My name is Sasha Drobnick. As Katie mentioned, I'm DV Leap's legal director. I've been with DV Leap for, I think, 9 years now, and just my second year as legal director. Before DV Leap, I was a private practitioner practicing family law in Maryland for many years, focusing primarily on low-income clients as well as domestic violence survivors. And prior to that, I had kind of a circuitous career where I did some international women's rights work. What drew me to domestic violence, I think, is because I've always been interested in sort of the parallel tracks of women's rights and social justice issues, and domestic violence seems to be, for me, a logical intersection of the two. I started volunteering at a domestic violence shelter when I was in law school, and it's just an experience that stuck with me. So, and when I was a family law practitioner, it was surprising to me how many of the cases that weren't presented as domestic violence cases did in fact involve domestic violence. And even when I was working in South Africa on gender equity issues in higher education, the issues of violence against women primarily on those campuses, and particularly with intimate partners, were really shocking. So it was just sort of a theme that's kind of followed me throughout my career.
Wonderful. Well, thank you both. And I think we will just jump in and start discussing. So to start, maybe this makes sense to start with Alana, but can you help us walk through what are the steps a survivor of domestic violence might take, or what are their options towards the beginning of the process, so say after an incident of domestic abuse?
So a survivor has several options. I mean, I think the option we traditionally think of is when domestic violence occurs, they would call a police officer would come to the site, they would take a report, the man might be arrested, and the case would go to like the U.S. Attorney's Office, and the criminal case will proceed from there. But in DC, we have other options. So you could go a civil route. After calling the police, they might tell you to go to get a civil protection order. They might go the civil route, go to domestic violence court, get a civil protection order that protects them. It's like a stay away order for 2 weeks, and then they go to a hearing and then get an order for a year. Right now it's a little bit different because of COVID, and the periods of like CPOs are all crazy, but that's another option they can go to. So they don't necessarily have to go the criminal route to get protection. They can get a CPO and get the stay away order from the abuser and not go the criminal route at all. And that's mostly we've seen our clients, they don't necessarily want to go the criminal route for various reasons, mainly because they don't want their loved ones to be involved with the criminal system. They don't have faith in the criminal system. They don't want them to be involved with police officers, or they just don't feel comfortable going that route for whatever reason. But they'll maybe we're interested in going the civil route. So there's like two different ways they can go, or they can do both. They can go the criminal route and get a civil protection order along with doing, bring up a case in the criminal world. I mean, that's up to the U.S. Attorney Office whether or not they want to bring a case, but they could participate or not participate in the case with the U.S. Attorney.
Interesting. So that actually goes to the next question I have, which is about the interactions with law enforcement. And as you just touched on, maybe reasons why a survivor might not want to go the criminal route, as you just suggested. So a recent statement by the DC Coalition Against Domestic Violence discusses the intersection of police response and domestic violence. And the statement recognizes that some survivors do depend on law enforcement or the criminal system to obtain safety or enforce court orders. But the statement also recognizes that we cannot ignore the treatment that Black and Brown residents receive in the district by law enforcement. And relatedly, a 2015 study by the National Domestic Violence Hotline found that 1 in 4 victims were either arrested or threatened with arrest during a partner abuse incident or while reporting a sexual assault incident to the police. And so, Alana, I think you just mentioned this, but could you maybe explain more about the experience of survivors, particularly Black survivors, when interacting with the police here in the district? And as you said, maybe why they would be hesitant to involve the police?
I think with Black survivors, I think someone has to, point out that for Black women in general in this country, Black women are not given the kind of the privilege of being seen as victims in society, or the privilege of being believed. I think there's a phrase going on right now called "listen to Black women, believe Black women," because we aren't believed. We aren't seen as victims of physical abuse or sexual abuse. We're seen of like fast or being just hot and tot, or other stereotypes that makes it seem like we want to be sexually abused, or we're tough and strong, we could take physical abuse. So the idea that someone's actually physically abusing us against our own desires is not necessarily something people believe. So, and then we're just seen as less credible, right? Like, so when police officers come, they just don't believe Black women as much. So the idea that police would come to a situation and believe Black women right away is not something that's realistic in the society we currently live at. So what my people have experienced is, one, they're not believed by the police officers, or they think they're over exaggerating the situation, or even if they are believed, they feel like, that the situation is a call for an arrest. And I had one client who didn't get arrested. The person wasn't arrested at the scene, but she didn't contact the police later to get someone arrested. And they were like, we had your chance at the scene to do the arrest. And that was like it. And it's kind of like, well, you had your chance, you didn't do it, so I maybe don't believe you anymore that it really happened, or, just like very cut and dry with people and not very respectful of the young lady, not very respectful of the clients. Sometimes they end up arresting the clients too, because like, we don't know who started the chance, we were fighting, we don't know who started the fight, and it's fairly evident that the man started the fight, or usually the man who's the abuser started the fight in this situation. So I think it's just like goes to like gender and racial dynamics already in the country. It's boiled down into the relationship with the police officers and the state really with Black women. Mm-hmm. So I don't think there's anything different than what's going on as a country. That's kind of boiled down to like kind of like pressured situation when it comes to police and Black women in DC, in the DC area. I can speak to the DC metropolitan area.
Sasha, have you seen any similar issues with like credibility of survivors, later in the process? I know your experience is more not with the initial interaction with the police, but some of these same problems with not being believed later in the process?
So yes, but I just wanted to back up to the, and just build on what Alana was just saying, or just share that you mentioned that the DC Coalition Against Domestic Violence has put out the statement on policing and survivors. However, they also convened a series of listening sessions with survivors over the summer. They convened 4 sessions, and the survivors, the participants were primarily survivors of color, mostly women, and they. Just to reinforce what Alana was saying, that was the responses from questions to the survivors about their experiences with the police were overall very negative, and that they experienced police not showing empathy, not believing them, or taking the report seriously, believing the abuser's version over their version, even being mocked or having the officers make sexist jokes. And so I did just a little digging, and this hasn't changed. The IUDO is an awesome organization that provides legal and social services to immigrants. Did back in the 90s, did a survey with immigrant survivors, primarily Latina survivors, and it was about their experience with police, and they had the exact same concerns with the added layer of the fear of deportation. But they said that of those women surveyed, over a quarter of them wouldn't even call the police, and of those that had, a third of them, the police didn't even talk to them. Many talked to the abuser instead of them. Those with visible injuries, still the abuser wasn't arrested. So it's just this is a trend that's been going on for a long time, and it seems we just haven't been able to address it accurately. As far as and also just to build that a little bit, the ACLU sponsored a study in 2015 looking at police response to domestic violence, sexual assault, and again, consistent results across the country. I think they had 900. It wasn't survivors that participated, it was service providers who worked with survivors. So advocates, lawyers, social services staff, but all reported the same negative interactions. And many survivors, particularly survivors of color, weren't willing to call the police, either based on bad experiences that they had or just the experiences of the police interaction in the community. In terms of at the appellate level, as you said, we don't see it as specifically. I mean, I can think of one survivor who came to us hoping to appeal the denial of a protection order, a Black woman who, when she called the police ended up believing the abuser and took on the police report, his reports, he didn't arrest her, but his report supported the abuser. So that foreclosed any opportunity that she might have to appeal. The credibility issue that Alana spoke about is a huge barrier for an appeal, because once a judge indicates that he or she doesn't believe the survivor's story and makes that credibility determination, an appeal is just about impossible. An appellate court almost never will overturn a trial court's credibility determination. To the extent that survivors of color are not willing to call the police because of past experiences, then and are denied a CPO, there's again less grounds to support an overturning that decision on appeal. And again, these are all ripple effects, but it's for survivors who aren't represented at trial, which are most, at least in DC. They're more likely not to be able to get a protection order, and a survivor who's seeking an appeal who hasn't been represented at trial, that it's very unlikely that he or she can appeal, just because it's unlikely they would be able to make an adequate record. So it's just that the barriers all ripple out from the type of barriers that Alana was talking about that survivors of color encounter at the trial level.
Mm-hmm. That's very helpful to, now we're kind of farther in the process and see how, like you said, how the effects ripple out. So are there other, Sasha, so I guess you just touched on credibility, and are there other big issues or barriers that you see for survivors when they're trying to access protection or justice in the legal system?
Yeah, a big one is, well, speaking from appeals specifically, a big one is inability to get transcripts because they're so expensive, and many jurisdictions don't provide any kind of a fee waiver based on income. So if a survivor is unable to afford transcripts, we as an organization definitely can't, we can't, that's how we make our determinations on whether or not there's a viable appeal, is by reviewing the transcripts. So, so that's an immediate barrier to justice. Also, again, I mentioned the lack of trial counsel makes it almost impossible to pursue an appeal. We've had a handful of survivors who were pro se at trial go ahead and pursue an appeal, but it's just really hard to make that record. I think the lack of access to adequate health services and mental health services for survivors to address their trauma and support them in that way oftentimes plays into the credibility bias because of the way that they come across in court. And again, that translates to a very difficult denial to appeal.
Definitely. So Alana, back to you. Maybe a similar question to what are some of the other issues or barriers you see in your work?
I mean, I would agree mostly with Sasha. I think lack of representation is a big one. I think it seems like if you work in the field, you have so many cases, you're kind of at capacity, and then other organizations are at capacity that we're representing a lot of people. I think it's a very low percentage of people are actually being represented in civil protection order hearings. So most people represent themselves, and it's really hard to do that pro se. There's a lot of rules and complications, and you have to be able to cross and know how to make a record if you want to appeal or just in general. And I think a lot of people don't feel like doing that in the first place. And then if they do it, they lose. And then there's a negotiation process you have to do in DC before you even get to CPO hearing, and that confuses people. So without any guidance, it's a really hard process for the average person to go through. That way to discourage people from doing it. And they may tell their friends or people in their lives that, this process is discouraging. This process is difficult. I don't necessarily want to go through it. And they feel like, well, my friend didn't want to go through this. Why would I want to go through it? So it might not seem worthwhile as a process to go through. I also think that people encounter with the systems in general, they might have no faith in the systems. And that might be the legal system. That might be the systems in service providers. Like they had no faith in the psychological system or mental health system. So that's why they're not getting help. Because maybe they don't feel like there's a culturally specific mental health system that can relate to them. So they're not getting the mental health that they need. They're traumatized. They're coming off, like Sasha said, as witnesses who are not very good witnesses, as lawyers we would want them to be, because they're not coming off as credible. They've come off with PTSD. They're not testifying the way we would want them to testify. They're upset. They're not linear thinking, different things like this. And so because of their distrust of different systems, it makes them less likely to be a good witness, and the distrust of other legal systems, the distrust of housing systems. So it's just like a distrust based on the life experiences of a person of color, specifically a Black person dealing with systems kind of does have a trickle effect to everything. Before they come to you as a client, they had all these other experiences in life that kind of give a lens to how they see your help to them. Or they just don't get representation at all, which is even worse than that.
Mm-hmm. And something you said earlier, I think maybe people in the audience would be interested in hearing more, is I think you mentioned that there's just a hesitancy to involve the criminal justice system and even to put the abuser into that system. Could you speak to that more?
I think it just depends on how you think of the criminal system. Or you think of it as a criminal justice system, or you think of it as purely punitive. Does it rehabilitate people, or does it put people in more abusive situations? So even someone's abuser, do you really want them to be abused in prison, subject to rape, subject to small quarters, subject to other types of harm? And you may not, though the person who abused you, you may not want them to abuse you anymore. You may not want to subject them to other harms that you find in the prison system. That may, they also could be giving you child support. They could be the person who's bringing home the food to the family. And so you're going to lose that support if they're no longer in the world making that money or giving you the child support. And I think some people are just very anti-carceral. They just don't believe in the prison system in general. They believe that there's different ways to handle a wrong abuse or wrong done in the community, either through community community-based interrupters, either through like restorative ways to talk to get the abuser and the person abused in the same room together to talk. Some people it's just like the carceral system doesn't work. The carceral system's against Black people. The carceral system's against Black men, and they just don't want to be involved in that kind of perpetration of like the cycle of Black men going into the incarceration system. And but mostly I think it's they don't want loved ones to be locked up. It's just quite frankly. They don't see the point of it. They don't see it benefits them. It doesn't make them feel safer. It doesn't undo the harm they've already done. They've been already harmed. It's not going to undo that harm. And sometimes it doesn't work. Like people get out and still harm them. So because it doesn't rehabilitate. I mean, depending on who you talk to.
Mm-hmm. And like you just mentioned, I thought that was interesting about if these people are also, they're members of the family. They help provide for family or provide for children or something along those lines. How does that? Well, I guess maybe if the survivor of the abuse also doesn't have other good support systems or other places to get help from, can that make it more difficult, or does that impact the decision about maybe reporting the abuser if that would make it really tough for you to get by?
I think it would. I think it'd be difficult to report the abuser. I think it'd be difficult to leave the abuser in that situation if you're depending on them financially, emotionally. So I think it takes people a lot of time. I think you have to leave. People try to leave like a certain amount of time so they actually can leave. And one of the big factors is financial support.
Mm-hmm. And so either Alana or Sasha, does DC have a lot of other support services or places that survivors can turn to for those resources?
So I know initially when people go to get a CPO, if they choose to, there's an organization called DC Safe that does helps petitioners, people getting the CPOs write petitions, and sends them to a listserv of other domestic violence legal organizations, and we can get cases from that referral system. There's also a Victim Legals Network DC that take in referrals for different types of cases throughout DC. It's a variety of cases, including domestic violence cases, and they do referrals to different organizations in DC. But there's quite a few. I think if you go to DC Coalition Against Domestic Violence, they have a list of them, of different legal organizations, but there's also different advocacy organizations in DC, we have a rape crisis center in DC, and we have different organizations that focus on children, over teenagers. It's just about looking it up and finding them. But there are different resources in DC, different shelters. There's like I think 2-3 big shelters in DC that do domestic violence.
So as Alana said, I think DC has a very a strong network of organizations that support domestic violence survivors, but there's still, those options going to a shelter, for example, they present some of the same problems that we've talked about. So you lose your housing, you lose your economic support, you might want to keep your family intact. So I think there's what is missing, and I think what there's a recognition of the need more for is more community-based solutions that kind of provide support before a survivor needs to actually move to a shelter or move to other types of legal assistance. And there are some good, strong community-based organizations out there, but I think that's the direction, and what came out of those listening sessions that the coalition hosted was that survivors really are interested in having alternatives to relying on the police and existing structures, and more community-based, more solutions where they have control of the process and don't have to involve the police.
Well, I think maybe that could be a good segue to the next part of the discussion, unless Alana or Sasha, you have anything else you want to add about, the challenges, the issues, the current problems?
don't think so. Alana,
No,
Alana has anything else?
I think that's fine.
Yeah.
Okay. So as I just mentioned, I think the next portion of the discussion, we want to talk about what you both started to mention about different alternatives, community-based solutions, things like that. And I think, it's why we want to make this part of the discussion as well is that, a part of advocacy, I think, is taking the time to imagine what the better systems would be like. I think it was, or at least this is where I first heard it, Representative Ocasio-Cortez said, you can't be what you can't see. And so like taking the time to think about what we want to create as a way of, getting there. And so what it would look like if we did have systems that could provide this support, provide accountability, provide these things in a way that would work better than what is currently in place. So that's just like the general frame for this part of the discussion. So to start, the DC Coalition Against Domestic Violence, in that same statement we've mentioned a couple of times now, stated that it believes survivors should have more options rather than just law enforcement when domestic violence occurs. So I think we've kind of touched on this, but what are there other alternatives besides, I think, Alana, you kind of set up the civil side and the law enforcement side. Are there existing alternatives to calling law enforcement, like at the time of a incident of abuse? And do victims know about those alternatives if they exist?
I don't think currently there are necessarily like set-up systems. I think a lot of organizations in terms of the DV world, domestic violence world, are looking to try to start up some systems. Right now, we've been talking about it and trying to set up like either a transformative justice or restorative justice framework in the DC area to kind of give people that choice, that if they want to do something alternative to the police officer or alternative to the civil system and just want some type of repair to their relationship with the abuser, or repair or restore themselves, that we are looking into restorative justice programs. More organizations looking to do one in-house, perhaps, like if we can get the grant money to do so, to set it up so our survivors can get safe circles, they can talk to the abuser, they can talk to a facilitator, different ways to get healing, because that's one of our goals of organizations, is to heal the survivor so they can thrive through the process of justice, rather than just go through a system, a criminal system or a civil system. But I don't know, there's CAS, which is the Collective Action for Safe Spaces, which they work a lot with sexual assault victims and the LGBTQ communities, that I think do their own transformative justice and within their own communities. They work with a lot of sex workers, and I think they do a lot of transformative justice within that community themselves, but it's not a mainstream thing like that I think you're talking about. Like the average person doesn't know about it. I just know about it because I'm in this work, but I think we're working towards that right now. As a domestic violence community, we're looking into it to try to make some changes.
Yeah, but there's a couple of programs not specific to survivors that exist in the district now. Like the mayor's office has an office of neighborhood safety and engagement, which is really focused on more of a public health response to violence. And then the Office of Attorney General here has got both a violence interrupters program, again, specific towards violence, not to specific towards survivors, but they also have, Alana mentioned, restorative justice. They have a pretty, it was pretty groundbreaking restorative justice program primarily for juvenile offenders. I think it's one of the model programs. It's one of the few that's actually in-house. It's fully staffed within the Attorney General's office. But yeah, as Alana said, we are, so she and I are both part of a group, the domestic violence attorneys, legal services attorneys in DC are all part of a group called the DC DV Advocates, and a subgroup of those people created a committee over the summer, sort of picking up on what your title, Katie, called Imagining Alternatives. So, and as Alana said, we've met pretty regularly looking at different options for survivors, and informed by the responses that came out of those listening sessions. So I think there's one organization that's looking at building out a restorative justice component to their existing services. The NVRDC, the national, what's NVRDC, Alana? National
Network for Victim Rights DC.
Thank you. Has coordinates with a restorative justice program out of Georgetown University now, and hasn't more for sexual assault survivors at this point, but is also a model for moving forward. And then, Alana, can you talk more about what you're doing with Safe Sister Circle?
So we are trying to start an in-house restorative justice similar to the NVRDC, but more in-house. And we're trying to find a facilitator, and preferably a Black woman, because we provide culturally specific services, to do restorative circles and to do abuser and abused conversations and facilitator-based therapy sessions for our clients and ones who don't necessarily want to go through the civil system or the criminal system, or maybe they do want to go through all three of them. But it's basically a way for they can get justice in our system. So we applied to some grants to try to get us a way that we can set up that system in our organization. So when our clients come to us, they have options of what they want to do through the justice system. So that's what we're kind of setting up now. So it'll be very similar to NVRDC, but on a smaller scale. And it would be culturally specific because it'd be run by a Black woman, ideally. And it'd be someone who's trauma informed and someone who is holistic and is, have experienced intimate partner violence, as well as the restorative justice framework. And it would be, aimed at our clients specifically. So a little bit smaller, and we domestic violence and sexual violence. It wouldn't just be sexual violence, it'd include intimate partner violence as well. So that's kind of what we're looking to set up. So we're excited, hopefully, it comes through.
Yeah, no, that's super exciting. It's the restorative justice model seems to be the model that is the most viable as an alternative for survivors, but it's tricky, right? Because, domestic violence perpetrators are all about power and control. And so restorative justice is built around, dialogue and mutual support and consensus and accountability. And so that can be tricky with an abuser, especially abuser who likes to exercising power over the survivor. So there haven't been as many initiatives, but there are several programs nationally that have been successful working with survivors of sexual assault and interpersonal violence, and using.
I don't think it's for everyone. I don't think it's for every scenario or every situation. I think it's for very specific situations. I think.
So I've heard of in some cities, there's been like recent initiatives to take like mental health response out of law enforcement and have like community support that could be called in instead of calling the cops if someone was having like a mental crisis. Are there any similar initiatives, or could there be something similar where say there is an incident of abuse, someone is harming someone, that you could call some other kind of support, a social worker, or any other kind of response rather than just calling the cops?
I think people are working on that currently, but I don't think it's not a thing in DC as of now, but I think people are calling for it for sure in DC, that's a request that they just put money into community-based mental health programs. So I think that's true, that people are having a mental breakdown, that you want someone who has experience, not just force, coming to the situation. Mm-hmm. I know in New York, there's like a Center for Court Innovation have put out a release about 10 ways to decrease the police footsteps in communities. And their one was like, along with like community interrupters, their thing was like having mental health illness people go into the communities for situations just like that, during domestic violence incidents or other incidents, and help fix the problem, or help, through the problem, at least before the police came or in lieu of the police. And it's something that's taken, they're submitting to like the council up there in New York City. So I think it's something that people have been talking about. I don't think it's in place now.
Mhm.
The DC Council in their budget from the last summer did increase funding both to those two programs I was talking about that target violence, both the violence interrupter, the Cure the Streets program, and also the Office of Neighborhood Safety and Engagement. There had been funding cuts in light of everything that happened this summer. They replenished and increased the funding, and I think both of those programs have specific priorities around mental health-based, community-based responses. But like Alana says, I think that's still really in the beginning stages. We do have some of our awesome DV organizations do mental health support. NVRDC in particular does wraparound services, and others do as well. In fact, Alana, at first that was part of Safe Sister Circle's mission initially, right?
And that's something we're trying to get into also in the future. But it's not something we currently provide. We currently provide referrals to different organizations that provide therapeutic services.
Yeah, it's such an important component of addressing, healing for survivors and supporting survivors.
I think that and housing are like three. Legal, housing, and therapy are like the big threes.
Yeah,
like helping someone who's in a situation.
Yep.
So I think we had a related question in the chat. Someone asked, do you think mandatory reporting erodes these kinds of community-based support systems?
Excuse me?
Oh, I'm sorry. The question was, do you think mandatory reporting erodes those community-based supports?
So that's a tricky question for us because as lawyers, we don't have mandatory reporting. Except for, we have confidentiality. From my understanding, and I know like during our training, we have other domestic violence advocacy groups that mandatory reporting is an issue. I don't know what that issue is particularly. I know especially with young people, that people are less likely to go and report things because it's mandatory reporting for young people. So it is like a barrier for them to get involved with organizations because they mandatory report them, and they don't want to be mandatory report to their parents or to the officers about sexual abuse or the intimate partner violence. I know it's a thing definitely with like teenagers in DC. I think there is probably similar things with adults, but I'm just not sure because that's not really something we as attorneys come in contact with.
Got it. Thank you. Did you have something to add, Sasha?
It's in sort of a different context, but I know that on college campuses, the mandatory reporting requirements are problematic to some college student survivors coming forward just because of the same reasons Alana was describing.
Okay. So I think we can move soon to the question and answer portion. So just to the audience, you can use the question and answer box to put in a question, and there's also maybe a few questions in the chat I'll get to, so you can use that too. But one last question before we turn to the audience's questions. So Alana and Sasha, working with survivors of violence and trauma can be, I'm sure, very rewarding, but also difficult and challenging. You spend a lot of time hearing stories of trauma and harm. So I was curious what you do to take care of yourself so that you can keep being such great advocates.
So I guess I go myself. I think it's important to have boundaries between you and your work. It's very difficult to do. I like saying it, but it's like difficult to do, especially because our clients, I think, will contact us late or contact you, may have an emergency on the weekend or may have like off hours that they relate to you and you deal with them a great deal intimately because you're dealing with intimate partner situations and custody cases about their inside their lives. But I think trying to set boundaries away, but I think for me personally, even the vicarious trauma or just the type of like speed or that you deal with as these type of cases come and kind of like crises that have come, I go to therapy, to be honest. Like I have a therapist and she helps me. I mean, among other things, it's not just because of my work, but I just think I find it very helpful to have a therapist to talk to about my cases and to talk about, not my cases, but to talk about like dealing with survivors of violence and like how to maintain my own sanity in that situation, in those situations.
I mean, I think Alana's just nailed it. It's really, I think the most important part is recognizing when you're being traumatized by your work and having having that self-awareness so that you can take the steps that you need to take care of yourself. So, DV Leap has always been very conscious of vicarious trauma issues. And our founder, Joan Meyer, that was certainly a priority for her. That's carried through all through the organization's life. I think we at DV Leap, we're given the flexibility to take time if we need time, and to just to be very open about kind of what we need to take care of ourselves.
Well, thank you both for sharing those personal responses. So I will take a second to look in the question and answer and see what people are asking. So the first question, how or have you seen informal pipelines to law enforcement impacting how survivors of color reach out for support? When I say informal pipelines, schools, doctors' offices, advocates. I guess this is again like a mandatory reporting related to that.
I saw that question too. I think in terms of informal, non-mandatory reporting, I think we've had people like community. Oh, hold on, that's my Google phone number. Go to Sasha, come back.
Yeah, I honestly, we don't have as much experience with the impacts of the mandatory reporting, so I don't have a good answer for that. I'm sorry, Alana, I didn't.
No, it's okay.
On that one.
It's like my Google Voice that doesn't like. I had to go to my Gmail. Okay, what I meant to say, like we have community members sometimes reach out to us for support or for legal services. Like there was a birthing center and Silver Spring that reached out to us. They had a client who'd been abused and needed some support, legal support. They reached out to us. Like church members have reached out to us, people's family members, because we try to get embedded in Ward 7 or 8 and in the community. So informal, so they don't necessarily come for our listservs or through like a referral systems. They come through directly from the community through informal ways. They don't have to necessarily go to the court and file something or go to DC Safe to file something. They can just reach out to us directly if they have issues they need help with or legal services. Mm-hmm. And they need like therapy or stuff like that. They can directly reach out to those organizations as well if they just need the services that they provide. They don't need to just like go through like a system of like legal stuff. They could just reach out to them directly.
Okay. So another question, could either of you talk a little bit about DC courts in particular, and if they have any programs or resources, particularly for people of color, and have you seen any improvements over time or changes over time?
They do not have specific programs for people of color. I have not seen any improvements. I think that people of color, particularly Black and brown women, are not treated very well in the court system, when I can see, and domestic violence court and family court. I think the idea of credibility is a big issue again. I think there's stereotypes, especially young women with children who maybe have government benefits, who come from different backgrounds, very different from the people who are judging them. It has a big effect on how they're treated in court. So I think actually they aren't treated very well by the court system. And I don't think that's changed. I think if anything, it's probably getting worse as disparities in wealth and cultures are increasing in this country. So I think that's a problem that needs to be addressed, actually. I actually had a white judge tell me, my client and the other attorneys who was also Black, and our clients were Black, stop fighting like a bunch of insects. And I was like, excuse me?
Oh.
And it was just a very culturally offensive thing to say to like 4 brown people or 4 Black people specifically in domestic violence court loudly for the whole court to hear. And so that's just an example of kind of the things you face in DC court. So my answer would be no, things are not getting better.
Yeah. Sasha, do you have any?
I mean, I don't have the direct experiences that Alana has. I can say, and I certainly don't know of any progress or any programs. I can only echo what Alana is saying. Just the way that we primarily determine whether or not we can take an appeal is, as I mentioned, to read the transcripts, and it is those biases and the treatment by judges. Specifically when the survivor is a person of color, it does come through in the transcripts, and that's not just in DC. That is all over the country for our cases, and so that's not a solution answer, but it is just that it does seem to be the reality, and it's subtle, but you can see it on paper too.
So another question. How can providers work to address the dearth of survivor representation in the court system that results from a lack of provider capacity?
I'm sorry, I was trying to read the question while I was listening.
Me too, I was trying to read that.
Can you read it again?
Yeah, so this was in the chat earlier. How can providers work together to address the dearth of survivor representation in the court system that results from a lack of provider capacity?
That's a huge issue. The access to DC's Access to Justice Commission did a report. It came out last year. And the number of unrepresented litigants in domestic violence court, I think, were 88% on the petitioner side and 94% on the respondent side. I think encouraging pro bono representation and partnering with law firms in a way that we can train up pro bono attorneys to provide adequate legal representation is one path. It's a particularly in the custody and DV custody context, it's really problematic.
I would agree with Sasha. I think because we're going to have so many amounts of people who work on these issues in the DC area, and we only can afford to pay from like grants and fundraising a certain amount of people to do this work. But I think going partnerships with maybe smaller firms or larger firms, or maybe smaller family firms, family law cases would be a good way to just get more people involved in these cases that people, couldn't afford. Then we have more representation. Different pro bono volunteer work from other attorneys who don't work in this field would be great.
I think we have a few more questions. How effective are you finding court diversion programs at stemming reoccurring intimate partner violence? If either of you have experience with that.
I don't at my job now. And this is going to sound kind of weird, but I was a prosecutor at the beginning of my career in New York. Despite my anti-carceral beliefs now, and there were some diversion programs, and I was out in New York City, and there were some diversion programs. And I thought some of them worked pretty well, actually. Like there was one for fathers, and there was one specifically for Latino fathers, because there was a problem with like machismo culture and things like that going on in New York City, because we had Spanish Harlem there. And some of them worked pretty effectively just to get like, teach people like culturally how to get out the cycle of violence and things like that. So I've seen some diversion programs work. Some of them were like empowering women, helping them get jobs or helping the husbands get jobs. So it wasn't so much oppression that caused the people to get, across the different layers of oppression that caused people to be violent in the first place. So I think, I don't know in DC what the diversion programs are like, because I'm just not on the criminal side of things in DC. So I couldn't really say.
I don't have experience with any diversion programs. I'm sorry.
Well, thank you, Lana. That was so helpful. Let's see. So I think maybe two more questions if we have time. So someone writes, in my experience representing survivors, mostly survivors of color in protection order cases, there was a lot of pressure for survivors to settle and agree to protection orders without admissions. What are your thoughts on this? Is this client-centered and trauma-informed? Or is this undue pressure that does not preserve clients' rights?
So I think it depends on the client. Like I said before, like if clients are affected by trauma to the point that you think they're not going to be good witnesses, or the cases aren't particularly strong in terms of like, if you would take a case to trial, it's not going to be a strong case to a hearing in DC, a domestic violence hearing. Or for instance, if you feel like they're not credible enough, or you feel like there's a credibility issue, you have to know that going in, there's going to be a credibility issue, especially if they're, like I said, a Black woman, there's always going to be there's always going to be a credibility issue just from the jump. Then I don't think giving them choices on possibly choosing a settlement for CPO is a bad thing. Now, I do know there's a lot of pressure in DC courts to do it. I'm saying you give people those choices and tell them the pros and cons of everything and to come to their own conclusion, but give them like realistic choices. And saying like, look, you don't have a strong chance of getting a CPO if we go to a hearing. You have a better chance of getting consent without admissions. And I think you should probably go this route, but at the end of the day, it's your choice. And so I think it could be trauma-informed and client-centered. If you think for this particular client, that's a better choice, that's a better chance of them getting a CPO. Because at the end of the day, the CPO is kind of the goal because they want to be protected. You don't necessarily need someone to admit they've done wrong. I mean, it helps in certain custody cases. But outside of custody cases, really them admitting it, I mean, it might give them some vindication that the person admits to be doing wrong. And sometimes people want that. That's fine. But outside of like those situations, or maybe they have a company criminal case, maybe that affects it. But generally, like a CPO is a CPO, and it's going to protect them for a year. Or now it's 2, I think, for the new CPO laws to just come out. It's a little bit, it's longer. They'll get it regardless. And they'll get a protection regardless. And if someone violates it, they'll get a contempt regardless. If they do it without admission or do it with admission, there'll be a violation and contempt of the civil protection order, regardless how they got the civil protection order.
Well, thank you. So I think we should wrap up since it's almost 1. So thank you so much to Alana and Sasha for all your insight and your experience and sharing it with us. Thank you for everyone for attending. As Leanne said in the beginning, we have another Women's History Month. TV Leap has another Women's History Month event. And the next one is March 24th with Carrie Goldberg, the victims' rights lawyer. So we would love to see you all there too. And if anyone is interested in the DV Leap Advocacy Council and becoming a member of that, please email Flora at dvleap.org. So thank you all again, and thanks so much, Sasha and Alana.
Thanks for having us. Take care.
Bye.